Over the past 4 years, we've been fortunate enough to slowly move ourselves up market to where 4 years ago, we were predominantly just working with 7-figure e-commerce brands. Now we predominantly just work with 8 and 9-figure e-commerce brands. And because of that, we've had really good visibility and insight into what separates a 7-figure business in the e-commerce space from an 8 and a 9-figure business. In conjunction to that, I've also to date had direct consulting exposure inside ad accounts, inside Shopify stores to over 1,000 different businesses, a lot of them being 8, 9 figures, a lot of them being 7 figures as well. And so we've been able to identify commonalities between what separates a 7-figure business in the e-commerce space from an 8-figure business. And that's what we want to deep dive into and go through in this video. The idea is that if you are a 7-figure business watching this video, you can start to pull out similarities from what I'm about to walk you through, and then start to work towards what 8-figure businesses are doing and how they actually got there. If you're an 8-figure business watching this, you can just vet whether what I'm saying is correct or not because you've already been through the journey. So if you disagree with me, please let me know. We're going to go through this in this cyclical cycle of starting with product. We're going to move into distribution. We're then going to go into talent, risk portfolio, and then back into how that turns you into an 8-figure business. So starting off with product, and it wouldn't make sense to start anywhere other than product because this is ultimately the business. The business is selling product online to consumers. And so what this ends up meaning, so let's branch this out over here. What I'm directly talking about here particularly is product market fit. And so the reality is that if you don't have product market fit, it's going to be very, very difficult to get to 8 figures. Now, I still believe you can get pretty close to 8 figures even with terrible product market fit. You just probably won't make a lot of money and you have to be unbelievably skilled to do so. But the reality is that product market fit is really a requirement to get to 8 figures. You would argue that if you get to 3 to 4 million, you've probably already proven product market fit, which leads into the number 2 component of product, which is the biggest buzzword ever now, but I'm going to put it in here, unit economics. What does the unit economic profile look like of your primary hero product? Are you operating on 20% GP? Are you operating on 70% GP? Very different scenarios. To date, I have never worked with an 8 or 9-figure brand that has bad unit economics because I ultimately don't think it's even possible to get 8 to 8 figures with bad unit economics. I actually take that back with a few circumstances that have just come into my memory where they are a retailer. And so you can achieve, in fact, I've seen 9-figure businesses in the retail space that have 25% gross margin. And so you still can have poor gross margin here. You just have to really achieve scale to make any money. Those businesses operate on tiny net profit percentages in the low single digits. And so even with that being said, it's not a desirable business that most people want to build. Most people don't set out to build a $100 million revenue online business that's operating on 2% net profit. You'd much rather, at least I would assume, operate a 20x smaller business that's doing $10 million a year, but is at 25% EBITDA. Both businesses make the exact same amount of money, except one of them has a massive risk profile because they have to hold so much inventory, because they have so many staff, because it's just generally a massive business compared to the smaller one. So generally, people, when they think about growing a business, probably want to grow the smaller business with the higher margin rather than the bigger business with the lower margin. Unless there's some kind of exit strategy that just confuses it a little bit more. The third component in here, which starts to come into play as you bridge into 8 figures, is, I'm just going to simplify it here to SKU count, but it's ultimately how large is the product portfolio. And so are you just selling one product and trying to go to 8 figures on one product? Still very much so possible, but not across like micro niches. And so if you are really niche down, which is where people often find rapid success when you can find a clear value proposition that's going to cut through the market at a small scale, how do you actually expand that product portfolio? Not too aggressively, to where you start focusing on 10 different products and nothing actually really works, keeping consolidated, but having a really strong second and third product launch that builds the product portfolio out, that increases LTV, increases AOV, and then increases your spend capacity within the ad accounts because you can spend on more products across more different angles, concepts, etc. And so this is really the 3 components that differ between a 7 and 8 figure business on the product side. And once again, product is the most important first component of an e-commerce business because that is literally what you are delivering. Do you have product market fit? How well has product market fit been discovered? Number two, do you have a unit economic profile that is actually scalable into 8 figures, especially if you're going to use paid media as your primary driver of acquisition? You need to be able to spend, as a general rule of thumb here to actually give some specificity, you really need to be able to spend at least 25% of your revenue on marketing, so a 25% MER, or you just simply won't achieve 8 figures online. You need to have that kind of flexibility, which is only achieved through a low cost of delivery percentage and a relatively compressed operating expense percentage. And then lastly, SKUs. If you are not successful in secondary or tertiary product launches, it will be very difficult to get to 8 figures. Is it possible? Yes. Can you be bad across all of these 3 and still get to 8 figures? Yes, because I'm going to go into some more components in a second that you could be excellent at and you'll still get there. But these 3, you really want nailed down if you're going to try to achieve scale. Number 2 is distribution. You might be looking at this and thinking actual 3PL distribution, cost of delivery, can the product actually be shipped for a cheap cost? That's not what I'm talking about at all. That was included in unit economics. Distribution here, I'm referring to marketing. Particularly, let's go into paid media. And so the question is, how well can you market the product and distribute at a low CAC? And so this is ultimately going to come down to what is your cost to acquire a customer? You could have the best product margin in the world. You could have really strong product portfolio that all have really good product market fit. But ultimately, if you can't distribute the product well, you'll never be able to get to 8 figures. In fact, here's where arbitrage starts to exist, is that I've seen multiple brands over the course of the last few years that have ultimately pretty average product market fit, have pretty average unit economics, have done some pretty average product launches, but they are so good at distribution, they are so good at marketing, or they have some kind of arbitrage in marketing that they've been able to capitalize on, that they can get themselves to 8 figures. And so they can be weak over here, but really strong here and still make it into 8 figures. Now, can they make it into 9 there? No. The ultimate segment between 8 and 9 is that a 9-figure business is excellent across everything that I'm running through in this video. But if you can be really excellent at distribution, you can often get into 8 figures. However, if you're an Australian business, it's usually going to be reliant on an expansion into the US. Getting to 8 figures online with poor product market fit and average unit economics just through being really good at marketing and having a low CAC, you're going to have a glass ceiling that's going to be hard to break through until you fix the fundamentals. Now, with most 8-figure brands, once again, this isn't applicable to everyone, and we're trying to make generalizations throughout this whole video, but most 8-figure brands, where they start to differentiate from 7 figures, is that they aren't solely reliant on paid media, let's call it Meta or Google Ads, as their primary driver for acquisition within the entire business. They're under the presumption that they need to diversify risk by also putting efforts elsewhere. And it's often those efforts elsewhere that actually compound into paid media and make their paid media performance actually increase. You can look at 2 very similar businesses, look at 2 ad accounts, almost identical ads, almost identical angles, almost identical creative and product. But then one has a 10 ROAS, the other one has a 4 in platform. And the only difference is that the one with 10 is heavily investing in other channels, which is amplifying and providing this halo effect on paid media performance. And so it's trying to build this halo effect to where paid media can actually perform better because there's these other efforts occurring. What actually are those efforts? It could be activations. So these are events with influencers where they're all posting and creating a viral event on social media. Another one can be specific tactical product launches that are collaborations with other brands. There can be, as I said, collaborations with other brands, even if that's just within their email database. This is fairly applicable to actually quite a few 8-figure brands that we work with, which is that they've done heavy investing in SEO for 3 to 4 years, and then they actually start to reap the rewards, and it actually becomes a fairly decent channel for revenue performance, and then that just further inflates paid media as well, because those people might not buy on first touch, and then the retargeting through paid media improves performance there, or vice versa. Top of funnel on paid media, they go to Google, they search for a cold key term, you already rank high organically, trust is built, purchase is made, acquisition cost drops across the board. And so it ends up being a function of how good are you at marketing and being able to actually distribute a product once you have a good product. And then are you building diversity into the mix and not going, hey, we're only going to rely on paid media, but we're going to build in these other channels and we're going to make efforts elsewhere in the business that's going to cause a halo effect and actually allow and achieve further scale through the primary driver of spend here. That then leads into number 3, which is talent. And this is, I can't remember where I heard this, but I really like it, which is that the total revenue capacity of a business is the function of the summation of all skills across the talent pool within the business. And so you take the total skill set of every single person that is currently operating within the business and you add it all up, and that will give you an estimation of your maximum revenue cap, because the function of growing a business is the function of how many skills you have. And so skill accrual is the goal if you are trying to achieve scale and volume. And so when we start to look at 7-figure businesses starting to bridge into 8, a key differentiator here is a 7-figure business most of the time in e-commerce, which is relatively lean. We're talking about 2 to 4 people maximum in terms of like key operators that are working 40 hours a week on the business, not just, let's say, 3PL or fulfillment staff, or let's say a VA helping with customer support, etc. When we're looking at actual full-time core members within the team, you're talking a very small team. Ultimately, you can operate a $5 million e-commerce business with just 2 founders and then some fulfillment staff and VAs if you obviously really want to stay as lean as possible. Once you bridge into 8 figures, that starts to become unfeasible and just not possible. And so then it starts to come into hiring a core team. And ultimately, when I look at the 7-figure businesses that I've worked with and consulted on, then I look at the 8-figure businesses, and then I look at the 9-figure businesses, the one key differentiator across all of them when interacting is the talent of the individuals that I am interacting with. As you go into 9 figures, there's just an underlying competence that exists because you cannot operate at 9 figures without underlying A players and competence within the business. It's just physically impossible to achieve that kind of scale if those skill sets don't exist outside of the founders and within the core team. As you go into 7 figures, it's very possible for 7-figure businesses to exist with really no core talent existing outside of the founders. And so that's where ultimately this gap starts to become prevalent, which is that the limiter on a early stage 7-figure business is the core skill set of the founder. And so how quickly can the founder upskill over time to be able to therefore grow the business ends up being the bottleneck in majority of cases. Because when we zoom out and just look at this and we go, these are all the bottlenecks and these are the core differentiators between 7 and 8-figure e-commerce businesses. Ultimately, a founder of an e-commerce 7-figure business, there is a skill set that lies within there of being able to identify bottlenecks. And so anyone in a $1 to $6 million e-commerce business right now, all they are trying to do is figure out what is the bottleneck that is stopping growth. And that is a skill in itself. And it's likely one of these things. Now, there's obviously then micro kind of bottlenecks that exist underlying all of these. And so how quickly can the founder upskill and spend time trying to decipher bottlenecks and then push through them? Or ultimately, as you start to get into 8 figures where it's just physically impossible for the founder to have such a wide skill set that's going to continue to propel the company forward, what is the, let's call this the sum of skills within the business? And so when you take all of the hires that have been made and you sum up all of the skills, what is that going to allow you to grow to? And ultimately, this is like a massive differentiator within businesses as they start to enter into 8 figures in terms of the actual growth rate that exists within the business. You can have 2 identical businesses, identical products, identical market fit, identical marketing, everything's identical, but one business makes an incredible hire and then another business makes a very poor hire or even just an okay hire. And the fantastic hire will propel an extra 5-10% annual compounding growth into business A versus business B. And then over a 2 to 3 year time horizon, they're both in a very, very different position where one business might be 40% bigger than the other. And it was because one business had an incredible hire that was able to solve bottlenecks and had the experience within this particular position that the business is in terms of growth stage, versus the other who had no idea, learning it on the spot, has never dealt with these problems before, does not know how to actually solve them, will solve them eventually, trying hard, trying to learn, trying to figure it out, but that delays growth by 2 years. And so ultimately, the summation of skills that exist within the business of a 7 and 8 figure are tremendous. If there was a way to physically sum skills in any 7-figure brand and then sum up skills in an 8-figure brand, it's probably like a 10x differential between the two. And then it wouldn't be a Blue Sense digital video if there wasn't some kind of reference into finance, which leads into risk. And so when you're growing an e-com brand, ultimately, if you're growing fast, you have pretty much no ability to distribute earnings in the company because you need all free cash flow to be reinvested into inventory purchasing and other investments that exist within the business, like marketing spend, anything that's involved in the cash conversion cycle. And so what ends up happening here is that the growth rate is limited by the risk profile in which the founders or core stakeholders within the business are willing to take on. And so if you're willing to take on an enormous amount of risk, what that can lend itself to is using financial instruments to be able to finance growth. And so you're effectively taking out loans to be able to finance future inventory. There's obviously levels of aggression that you can go here, and so you might lend on the more aggressive side. And then as long as everything pans out and does well, you're going to get massive payoff in the form of considerably higher annualized revenue. And then obviously you can focus on profitability and pulling cash flow in, etc., and working towards dividends being yielded within the business as well. But if you have a low risk profile, it's often going to really stunt growth. And ultimately, this has always been the case, and I don't have a massive sample size here, so I could be completely wrong on this assumption, but this has always been the case with any hyper successful person that I've ever interacted with, which is that they have massive appetite for risk. They just want to put all the chips on the table and they just like keep doing it over and over and over again to the point where it's like looks delusional from an outside perspective, where you're like, I cannot believe that much risk has continued to be taken, particularly with the stage in which the business is at. How can you keep putting chips on the table? But it is through reinforcement of putting chips on the table and then winning, and then putting chips on the table and winning, that also starts to feed into this repetitive cycle of increasing risk. And that's also why, like, there's that stat that self-made millionaires will file for bankruptcy about 3.5 times over the course of building their wealth. Whether that's true or not, who knows? But it kind of gets the point across, which is that why do self-made millionaires go broke pretty much 4 times throughout their life? It's because they get reinforcement from taking risk and then seeing success. And so then they continue to take risk. And it's also likely the case that this kind of risk portfolio of an individual is what ends up yielding outsized returns. And so then ultimately that then brings us all the way around into becoming an 8-figure brand. And so to zoom out and summarize this video, the core differentiators that we have personally seen, and once again, this is a subjective video, this is not the objective reality of life, but these are our learnings to date, which is that when looking at the differences between a 7 and 8-figure brand, it primarily comes down to product and the subcomponents that exist within product, which is market fit, unit economics, and the product portfolio. Then it comes into their ability to distribute through some kind of channel, whether that is wholesale, whether that is direct-to-consumer paid media, whether that is SEO, activations, product launches, TikTok shop, etc. It's a strong ability to distribute. Then ultimately, the bottleneck becomes talent. The total revenue capacity of a business is the summation of the skill set that exists within that business's staff. And then lastly, you are capped, particularly within e-commerce, and to be honest, probably every business, in terms of your ability to take risk. And so those that end up having much higher risk portfolios end up taking much bigger bets that end up yielding outsized returns and end up landing them in that 8-figure range. Whereas those that have really, really small appetite for risk and don't want to go and take massive risk it's going to be very difficult to actually bridge in to 8 figures, or it's simply just going to be on a very extended time horizon. It might take 9, 10, 11 years to actually do so. If you're a 7-figure brand, comment, let me know if this was helpful. If you're an 8-figure brand, you think I'm absolutely wrong, also comment, and please let me know.